Well, welcome. We are back looking at early American Presbyterianism and American Presbyterian history in general. That's what we are looking at during this section of Sunday school. We didn't have class last week because of the snow, but we'll make up for that, and we'll keep going. So it would have been 2 weeks ago we did an initial welcome to this subject. And we didn't really do much history. Rather, we looked at some distinctives of the Reformed Presbyterian tradition and tried to situate ourselves within the broader Christian community. Well, today what we want to do is get into the history of it. And we're going to begin with early American Presbyterianism, 1706 up to 1789, if I can move quickly enough to get through that. But that's the time period we're looking at here. So we're looking at the history that begins in the colonies at the very beginning of the 18th century. My goal today is that we do a survey of most of this century, beginning with the first Presbytery meeting in Philadelphia, which met in 1706, and the growth that occurred leading to the first General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in 1789. But before we get to 1706, we need to look back into the roots of Presbyterianism that came out of the Protestant Reformation. So these are the roots of Presbyterianism, stretching back to the early 1600s, even back into the 1500s at when the Reformation was taking place. So Presbyterianism is rooted in the Reformed Protestant tradition, owing a great deal of its theology and church government, of course, to the work of figures like John Calvin in Geneva. One of Calvin's most influential students in Geneva was a man named John Knox. And you might know John Knox. He was a Scot, and he returned to Scotland and brought Presbyterian with him, and this was around 1560s or so. England, Scotland, and Ireland, these three nations faced a lot of turmoil in the 16th and 17th centuries. Kings and queens came and went, churches were established, then reorganized, then restructured, religious freedom was restricted, and then the cycle would just repeat over and over again. There's so much history during this 1550s or so, up to that 150 years up to 1706. There's way too much that we could look at just for our class today. We don't have time to get into all those details. But there's three basic things that you need to know about this time period before we get here that will give you the necessary background to understand some of the stuff that's happening right now. They're doing great back there. They're doing fantastic. All right. So the first thing you need to know is about the established churches in England and in Scotland. The Church of England was established in 1534, and that's, of course, during the reign of Henry VIII, but even more so his son, Edward VI, would lead the charge in reforming the English church. But the Church of England is established. It's an episcopal form of church government, which means governed by bishops. We talked a bit about that last time we were together. The Reformation also reached Scotland to the north, and primarily through John Knox. In 1560, the Scottish Parliament established the Church of Scotland along Presbyterian lines, meaning that they abolished the jurisdiction of the Pope. There were no bishops in the Church of Scotland. They had their own book of discipline, which outlined how the Presbyterian Church would be governed. So we have the Episcopal Church of England and the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. And they did not coexist all that well. In 1603, James VI of Scotland becomes King of England as well. He's James I of England. And now these two nations, even though they still have separate parliaments, they're separate nations, but they have the same monarch. And this is the James, of course, who would oversee the British colonies in the New World, Jamestown, one of the first colony there in America. There would be an English Bible named after this King James. And for the most part, under his reign, things are relatively civil. And in fact, Puritanism, those who wanted to purify the English church, they those groups quietly flourished under James. This changed, though, when James's son Charles I, he assumes the throne in 1625, and he appoints a new Archbishop of Canterbury. Remember, that's the highest bishop in England, which I still think they're open and looking for nominees. So you can fill your name out if you want to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. He appoints a new one. His name's William Laud. And through his work, he pressured conformity in the Church of England. This is how the Church of England is to be structured, which meant that groups like the Puritans, other groups that are grouped together as the nonconformists, those who didn't conform to the order and the worship style of the Church of England, they would flee to the Americas in the 1630s and 40s. Over 40,000 of these groups are coming now to the New World, which we know from stories like the Mayflower and those folks are coming now to America. Well, this same archbishop, even though, remember, there's one king, but they're separate nations, he didn't technically have jurisdiction over the Church of Scotland. He was an archbishop over the Church of England. However, this archbishop decided to overreach and to mandate the use of the English prayer book, which had ordered forms of worship and prayer, on the Church of Scotland, and establish bishops within this Presbyterian church. And if there's one thing you don't do, you don't tell a Scot how to worship. And you just don't tell him what to do. So that did not go over well. One thing led to another. Now there's an English civil war taking place, which is also part of a larger conflict, the war with the three kingdoms of Scotland, England, and Ireland as well. And it's within this context of civil war that the Westminster Assembly is called. So the first thing you need to know about background is the different established churches. The second thing then we need to know is the Westminster Assembly. English Parliament is in civil war with the monarchy and those loyal to King Charles. So even English Parliament is not all that thrilled with Charles and what he's doing, and they want to get rid of him. So you have the monarchy and those loyal to the king, and then you have the English Parliament. But Parliament needs help. So they decide to ask the Scots if they'd like to fight Charles with them. And the Scots don't like Charles much at all because he, with his archbishop, is trying to change and to infringe upon their religious liberty. So, in 1643, the English Parliament called the Westminster Assembly. And they asked for Scottish delegates to come down to this assembly to join them. Now, part of this agreement was that English Parliament would get the military aid of the Scottish army. And in return, what would Scotland receive for helping the English fight against King Charles? The Scots formed what's known as the Solemn League and Covenant, and they got the English Parliament to sign that Solemn League and Covenant. And that covenant would make Presbyterianism the uniform Protestant church in both England and in Scotland. And the work of the Westminster Assembly was to create a consensus book of standards for the church, for worship, for doctrine, for governance in this new united Protestant church. So that's what's happening here. Well, the assembly then, they're put to the task. They finish their work in 1647, and they finished the standards. So they finished the Directory of Worship, they finished the Westminster Confession of Faith, the larger, shorter catechisms. Those things are all finished. And the Scottish Parliament immediately adopts these documents. These are the documents for our church. But English Parliament doesn't. And this is one of the quirks of history. Well, why didn't the English Parliament also adopt these new standards as consensus for the church? Well, because their influence in the war and over the course of that civil war deteriorated with the commander of their army, a man named Oliver Cromwell. You see, he and his men leading this new model army, they weren't favorable to this new covenant that would have made Presbyterianism the church of the land. They were congregational, and they were independent, and they didn't want to be told how to worship either. And it also didn't help that Parliament had spent all of their money and they didn't have the funds to continue to support Cromwell and his men. So there is also a financial bit to that as well. So what happens? At this point in time, King Charles, he's still in the game, but he's been captured. Cromwell leads a coup d'etat against the English Parliament. He seizes King Charles, he takes control, and he executes the king. And now Cromwell is in charge of the nation of England. Well, the Scots are worried, how is this going to affect our church and our people? And they decide what's in our best interest is to take Charles's son, Charles II, and make him king. But you see, there's still a united monarchy. So when they declared Charles II king of Scotland, they're declaring that he was the king of England. Cromwell didn't take too kindly to that either. So he decides, no, I'm going to invade you, and now I'm also in charge of Scotland. How do you like that? So during all this, the point being, during all this is happening, the Church of England never adopts the Westminster Standards. As far as the English are concerned, the work of the Westminster Assembly is moot, because the English Parliament has been completely overturned and restructured. So the Church of England then continues to exist as it did previously. However, during all this time, various nonconformist groups, those are groups, again, that didn't conform to the Church of England, they continue to grow throughout the nation. And many of these groups will decide to take their chances at life and religious liberty in the American colonies. So, and I'll mention some of those groups here as well. So that's the third thing we need to understand. So we have the different churches established in Scotland and England. We have the work of the Westminster Assembly and how the Scottish Presbyterians adopted that, but the English never did. And now we have these waves of immigration that's happening this whole time to the New World, to the American colonies. There's just so much more, and that was such a brief overview. You can go and continue to research that yourselves if you're interested. There's a lot of details I'm leaving out and papered over. But for our purposes, what we want to see for our history is that several different religious groups that existed in the British Isles, they are making their way over now to the American colonies. So you have the established Church of England, or the Anglican Church. Then you have nonconformists of various stripes. You have the Puritans, you have Baptists, you have Congregationalists, and you have English Presbyterians, those in England who did want to be Presbyterian and adopt Presbyterian form of government. Then, of course, you have the Scottish Presbyterians that were continually steadfastly Presbyterian in their beliefs, and you have Scots-Irish. Scots-Irish were Scottish Presbyterians who were relocated to Northern Ireland, to Ulster, as part of this plantation that our King James, all the way back in the early 1600s, he resettled several Scottish Presbyterians into this plantation. These Presbyterians, they'd grow in number during the 17th century, and many of them would also make their way over to the American colonies, especially near the end of the 17th century and into the early 18th century. And it is one such Scots-Irish that is where we pick up our story with Presbyterianism in America. So, that was a lot. If your head's not spinning yet, I don't know. We have a man named Francis Makemie. Francis Makemie. He is known as the father of American Presbyterianism. He was born in Ireland in 1658. He was ordained in the Irish Presbytery in 1682 in order to become a missionary to the New World, and he makes his way to America in 1683. Makemie found that there was a lot of need for Presbyterian ministers to serve all the churches and people that had been arriving over the past several decades. There were already churches in Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, and they needed ministers. In 1704, Makemie made a trip to London to recruit more Presbyterian ministers that were there, and he brings a couple ministers back with him. And so he returns with him and 2 others, and there he gathers the other ministers that are already in the colonies, and they form the first presbytery. And that is what will start our timeline here in 1706 with the first presbytery of this American Presbyterian church. There were 7 initial members at this presbytery meeting, seven ministers. And that meeting, at that one meeting, they would ordain an 8th minister. Makemie was elected to be the moderator. Jedediah Andrews, someone who was born in Massachusetts, he served as the clerk, and he was the pastor of First Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia. And of that original 7 members, there were 3 New Englanders that were already born in or part of New England. 3 were Scots-Irish, and one was Scottish himself. So right away we see that it's a collection of different people from different backgrounds that we talked about in those 150 years prior to them coming here. This presbytery was formed and it functioned in much the same way that our presbyteries do today. So I hate doing this at the risk of sounding self-serving. If you're interested in what our presbyteries do, Dustin and I have a podcast. We're one of those people. We have a podcast, and we have been trying to talk about some of the distinctives of Reformed theology and Presbyterianism. We just did an episode with our stated clerk of our presbytery, Aaron Rains, who you all know, where we talked about, we did an overview and a review of what we did at our most recent presbytery meeting of our church, which was a few weeks ago. So we recorded that on the Reforming the Ozarks podcast. And I bring that up because it's really fascinating that the work of presbytery hasn't changed all that much from then to now. Presbyteries are there to provide oversight, to care for the ministers and churches within a geographical area. And they do other an important function of training and licensing and ordaining ministers to serve. And at our most recent presbytery, we did that exact same thing. We licensed 2 more men to preach within the bounds of our presbytery. So we licensed some men to preach in our presbytery. Some things stay the same. Some things are very different, though. We're in a different context. What was life like in the 1700s in colonial America? Well, you see, there's still vestiges of the established church in these colonies. And in fact, Makemie, he was actually jailed in New York in 1707 because he was preaching without a license in the Anglican New York. So it is a really different world in a lot of ways, but that's the world in which they lived. But he did, he made it out of that. He had to pay some hefty fines for his court fees to be released from jail in New York for preaching without a license. And then by 1708, Makemie dies and is buried in Virginia. And within the first 5 years of this presbytery, over half of those initial members would also pass away. But the seeds of Presbyterianism have been planted now in Philadelphia in 1706. And they're going to see a lot of growth that happens rapidly as more Scots and Scots-Irish continue to make their way to the colonies. So in 1716, we have another milestone, and that is the forming of the first synod. In 1716, that initial presbytery is split into 3 presbyteries, and then a synod is established to oversee the work of those presbyteries. So we don't have synods in the PCA, but that is just one other level above presbyteries, but still under the General Assembly to help organize and oversee the work of the church. And at this point, 1706, there's 17 ministers now overseeing the churches in this area. And this is very timely because in those years, and especially the years 1717 to 1718, over 5,000 Scotch-Irish sail for America. And by the end of this century that we're in right now, the number of Scots-Irish are going to be close to 500,000 in the colonies. But within this rapid growth comes some growing pains. And the first major pain that's felt in this young Presbyterian church is what's known as the subscription controversy. And I'll put a date up here, 1729. So the subscription controversy really begins in 1721, but 1729 is an important date. We'll get to that in a moment. In 1721, a minister named Robert Cross, he was tried by the newly constructed Philadelphia Synod, and he was found guilty of fornication. He was having an affair. What was the punishment for this affair? The Synod barred him from his pulpit for 4 Sundays, but otherwise he kept his credentials and he was a minister in good standing of the church. Now, I hope we can all agree that that punishment was insufficient for that and woefully inadequate to say the least. And thankfully, other members of his presbytery agreed that what Synod did was wrong. And they objected to the decision and even said that not only was this a heinous moral failing on this minister's part, but it was a doctrinal failing as well. And this began really in earnest the subscription controversy. In response to this event, the Newcastle Presbytery, the presbytery this minister was a part of, they began requiring ministers to subscribe themselves to the Westminster Standards. And part of the reason why is because the Westminster Standards have a very robust description of what sexual obedience looks like within the church and in accordance with the 7th commandment. And this was the first presbytery to do so. Previously, no ministers in the American church needed to formally adopt or subscribe to the Westminster Confession or to the catechisms. There was a mutual understanding that this is all of our shared tradition and background. We all believe the same things. But this was beginning to prove to be an inadequate foundation upon which to build this young Presbyterian church. So this presbytery, they started requiring their ministers to subscribe their names to the standards and saying that these documents are our statement of faith. This is what we think the Bible teaches. However, not everybody agreed with that across the Presbyterian churches. And they would put forward arguments saying, isn't Scripture sufficient enough? Why do we need a subsequent confession, man-made document that we put our names on? Does that sound familiar at all? You see, the same kind of arguments keep coming back and back. So this led to what's known as the Adopting Act, and that's the date here, 1729. The Adopting Act, which was an effort to bring some compromise and consensus to the growing two parties in this debate. The Adopting Act was passed at the Synod, and the Westminster Standards became the governing document of the American Presbyterian Church. But it was a compromise position. In that, ministers were allowed to submit their scruples with the language of the Westminster Standards, and that presbyteries were allowed to judge whether or not these scruples were allowed and that they could be ministers in the church. And there is a lot of debate, and I'm oversimplifying all this, but there's debate about the scope and the original intent of this Adopting Act even today. And we'll see the implications of this as we go through the history in these classes. One thing that's very important to know is that Synod did at that meeting, one of the things that happened is that everybody, the church in total, took exception to certain language in the standards about the role of the civil magistrate in relationship to ordering the affairs of the church. Remember, this was written in an established church context in Scotland and in England. And now in the Americas, where you have religious plurality, religious liberty, they took exceptions to some of the language there that would allow the civil magistrate to call synods, to do other work of the church. And this will actually eventually be formally changed as we get closer to 1789. But we'll get to that in a moment. What we need to know for now is that even though the standards are adopted here in 1729, tensions are not immediately resolved. And this is going to be a recurring theme throughout this class, and one of the reasons why I hope this will be helpful to us to consider our history. That this newfound unity they had in 1729, revolving around the standards, is going to be put to the test because there's going to be an awakening that sweeps across the American colonies during this century. And that leads to an eventual split that happens in the Presbyterian Church. There was continued suspicion with certain ministers' doctrinal beliefs within the church, and that led to some presbyteries preferring ministers who had credentials from the old world that were trained in the universities over there and then immigrated to the colonies. And they had less trust in the new colleges that were founded, Harvard and Yale in particular at this point. They had less trust in their training at these institutions. This would come to a head in what's known as the Log College, and that's an important, that shows up a lot. Those are L's maybe. The Log College that was started around this time as well. So in 1738, Synod required all ministerial candidates to have a degree from an old world university, or they allowed Harvard and Yale. But I'll get to Law College in a minute. There's some groups being trained there. And what that declaration did was say, we don't want you guys. At the same time, the Great Awakening was happening in the 1730s and 40s, and this was resembling a lot of what was happening over in England, across the Atlantic. You have figures like John Wesley over there, and how he really began the Methodist movement. And of course, when he would journey to the Americas, and the Methodist Church just explodes, and we'll look at some of that. But in America, the prominent figure was George Whitefield. So Log College, we need to explain a little bit of that. Presbyterian minister by the name of William Tennant, Sr., he founds the Log College in 1727, which was a log structure on his own property. And in there, he would train ministers for work in the church. And he trained several ministers, including his 4 sons, were all trained in the Log College. One of his sons, maybe the most well-known, is Gilbert Tennant. And Gilbert, would become very close associates with George Whitefield. And he accompanied Whitefield as he would go out preaching. And this led to a growing animosity and distrust between two sides of this debate and the eventual split. And we refer to these sides as the old side and the new side. So there's a split that takes place in 1741. And you have groups that are old side and ministers that belong to the new side. Old side ministers were those Presbyterian ministers and churches who were wary of this awakening and the revivals that were taking place. The new side, by and large, embraced the revival that was sweeping across the colonies. There are very strong debates that happen in the presbyteries and at synod between these two sides. The old side was concerned about ministerial qualifications. They're the ones that wanted to not allow ministers to be qualified graduating from the Log College. They were worried about a lack of theological precision, and they were wary of itinerant preaching like what was happening with Whitefield. They did not approve of Gilbert Tennant, who was preaching beyond and outside the bounds of his presbytery without invitation. He was preaching at other churches or holding outside meetings outside of his bounds, and that was not approved of. The new side, however, they emphasized the need for personal piety and for new birth. It was not enough, they believed, that you only say the right things, but has God brought a real change to your heart? They were very concerned about the Christian piety. So D.J. Hart, one of the historians that I mentioned in our last class, he writes that the fundamental tension in colonial Presbyterianism was whether to test the church's ministry by the objective measure of conformity to received teaching or by the subjective gauge of spiritual zeal. So there's the objective conformity to the standards, and then there's this more subjective gauge of spiritual birth and new life and revival. So tensions are reaching a boiling point in the Presbyterian Church. And Gilbert Tennant preaches a sermon called The Dangers of an Unconverted Ministry. And in that sermon, he specifically attacks old side ministers and brought into question their Christian experience and even their own regeneration and their own belief. He critiqued those opposed to his ministry and to the awakening. He compared them to Pharisees who, quote, deserve the wrath and curse of a sin-avenging God. Now, how do you think the old side ministers appreciated his sermon? They didn't like it all that well at all. They didn't take kindly to it. Quote, they objected to this emotional preaching style and bitterly resented Tennant's judgmental attitude toward them, as one historian notes. So, they split in 1741. This is the first split, first of many, unfortunately, that we'll look at. The old side ministers, they have the majority at synod that year, and they decide to eject all the new side ministers. They disqualify them from ministry. Those new side ministers then withdraw, and they form their own synod with the presbyteries that were already sympathetic to new side convictions and beliefs. So they formed a synod, and that was called the Synod of New York. And the old side synod was the Synod of Philadelphia. And they would remain separate until 1758, when the two synods eventually reunited. But life in the ministry did not cease during this time. Both sides continued to do the work of ministry and missions. One new side evangelist, Samuel Davies, he would form a new presbytery in Virginia, the Hanover Presbytery, in 1755. Also during this time, the New Siders would form and found the College of New Jersey, which would eventually find a permanent home in Princeton. And that would come to be known as Princeton College, which would later, we'd add on Princeton Seminary. So that happens in 1756. Well, what else happens during that time that eventually brought these churches back together, as often happens, is war breaks out. Almost immediately after the split that happens here, there's attempts to reunite, but there's tensions that are just really too high for any real progress to be made. But then a war breaks out in the colonies, and this is the 7 Years' War. And many of the Americans will join forces against the Native Americans and also the Roman Catholic French, and they would fight against them. And that included Old and New Side Presbyterians. They're joining arms in this 7 Years' War, or the French-Indian War. So here's how Sean Lucas recounts their eventual reunion. He says, as the colonies drew closer together to cooperate against a common enemy during this war, the two warring Presbyterian sides agreed to bury the proverbial hatchet. The old side accepted the New Side College of New Jersey as a Presbyterian institution. They also agreed that ministers ought to be examined for the new birth and genuine piety. The new side conceded that confessional subscription was important and that irregular theological training ought not to be tolerated. So we see some compromises there. They receive the New Side School, which would become Princeton, and the New Side acknowledges that, you know what, there was some excess in these revivals, and you know what, maybe we went a little too far with some things. So there's eventual reunion in 1758, and the church is reunited. The Synod of Philadelphia and New York merged to become the Synod of New York and Philadelphia. There, at the time, 96 ministers in this reunited, there's 96 ministers total at this time. 73 were New Side ministers. And so the vast majority were New Side. And during the previous 17 years of separation, the Old Side lost 5 ministers, while the New Side gained 50 ministers in several congregations. So, the New Side had the greater numbers there, but they were able to reach an agreement, and to demonstrate that, Gilbert Tennant, the guy who preached that sermon attacking the Old Side, well, he was elected to serve as moderator of the new United Synod when they met in 1758. And he himself had toned down and apologized for some of his rhetoric over the previous years. And at this synod, they agreed on a compromise statement about the awakening saying that it was a, quote, gracious work of God, while also acknowledging, quote, dangerous delusions that had been part of it. So they were able to reach an agreement and consensus on the awakening. Also at this synod meeting, it was an Old Side minister who was given the honor of preaching the sermon at the synod, and he says in part, quoting him, "We must maintain union in essentials, forbearance in lesser matters, and charity in all things. In a church like ours in America, collected from different churches of Europe, who have followed different modes and ways of obeying the great and general command of the gospel, there is a peculiar call for charity and forbearance." And so thus the American Presbyterian Church faced its first major test and had been reunited. And eventually we'll pick up next week in 1789 at the first General Assembly. But what we'll see is these fault lines continue to exist, and they'll continue to rear their ugly head. So what can we say about this first century of the American Presbyterian Church? From the very beginning, it was not reliant on any one church from the Old World, but it was always a collaboration between different groups who were trying to find the boundaries of where they could remain unified while also holding to different and important differences. And as I've reflected on this material, I just become more convinced that we have the same problems today, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but because this is our tradition, there's always going to be the same issues revolving around how do we be faithful to the Scriptures, to our shared confession of faith, and how can we continue to fulfill the Great Commission. That was the tension being fought over from the very beginning in 1706, and it continues to be our concern today. And as we go through the class, I hope that we can continue to see how we can continue to be faithful to those things. Thank you so much.